Welcome to the History of the Wellers Company, presented by Gary Finke, August 23rd, 2022.
Hearing on or seeing on Facebook, they mentioned Wellers, and people kept saying, "Oh, I love the smell of it when I was in big study hall, or when we were out with band practice at noon. The smell of Wellers was great." And I kept hearing that, so basically it became the smell that I loved. I've had a couple of people tell me they hated it. It was sickening. Jacob Weller started Weller Company in Covington, Kentucky in 1886. Now, we have a slight difference here because the obituary says he started in 1870. But what we found otherwise was 1886. He was from North Carolina originally. We have his marriage license down here. He got married in 1876, and the wedding was performed by the father of Woodrow Wilson, the president. Now, this is the first thing we found that he actually owned. It's a peanut company, wholesale company in Cincinnati. However, if you look at what they're selling here, they're selling pickles. And we didn't see that till we could blow it up on the screen and everything, but they actually were selling pickles and everything. And that was the first thing we had that actually showed that he had some type of company, and a J. Weller company and everything, and dealer and wholesale pickles. Back then, if you had pickles, you had to have some way of shipping them. So he had a cooperage company in Latonia, Ohio. This is from 1897. They made barrels. And if you look here, you got a barrel there. You got a shaving horse here. And way over on the edge, you got barrel staves, which would be very familiar to Oak Harbor because we have barrel companies that made staves and heads for barrels here from the oak that you had. So cooperage would be very similar to what he had there. But they did need stuff to ship them because barrels back then were the main way of shipping pickles, big barrels or little barrels. The other method was what they shipped in jugs, and they called them Acme pickles, was the J. Weller Company.
How big is that?
13 inches high. And they started with ceramic tops, and they kept breaking, so they changed and put wooden tops on them so that you didn't have the breakage. We got two things here listing Acme pickles. That one down there is Acme Pickles, Cincinnati. This one says J. Weller Company, Oak Harbor. So it had to be after 1897 because the factory moved here in 1897. 3 years later, the office moved here. Now, elsewhere in the exponent, and there are over 1,100 things that in the exponent about Wellers. I read all of them. They said the office was here. Then later on, they said the office moved here in 1914. But I think the 1914 date was the date that they built the concrete block office that they had. The plant was built in 1897, 98. The town was supposed to pay for part of the building of the plant. It was negotiated by H.A. Kilmer and Gordon Lumber Company with Weller Company. There ended up to be a lawsuit in 1903 over the fact that the town did not pay Gordon Lumber, and Gordon Lumber wanted the money out of J. Weller. J. Weller eventually paid for it. It was about $700, and we actually have a copy of the lawsuit laying over there on the table. So we do have a copy of the lawsuit and everything. Weller's lost the lawsuit, and they ended up paying for the stuff for the plant. Okay, these are buggies coming in with pickles. The first thing they had were pickles. First thing they were canning was pickles. 1906, and they're coming in from Town Line Street, and John can recognize the house back there who belonged to who?
Fred Connolly lived there at one time.
Okay, Fred Connolly's house. But if you notice, some of them are coming in with just 4 or 5 boxes of pickles. The number that they brought in was very small. They didn't bring a whole lot in when they were bringing them in. And the first thing they're canning were pickles. And back then, in 1898, they were paying 40 cents a bushel for pickles. This is approximately 1909, 1910. 1909, they put 2 new boilers in. We can tell the date because we found the old boilers sitting down here in the grass. You wouldn't buy 2 new boilers and let them sit down in the weeds and grass. So it had to be late 1909 or 1910. Now, this was the pickle canning part over here. You can see where the stacks were for the heat, for steam and everything, for heating the jars to sterilize them and everything. So this was the packing plant just for the pickle. In 1901, they canned 30,000 bushels of pickles and 275,000 cans of tomatoes. They also canned 25,000 cans of peaches. In 1904, pickles were selling at 60 cents a bushel to them, and they're looking for approximately 75 to 100 acres of cabbage because they also want to do sauerkraut. 1908, the plant did 30,000 bushels of pickles, 16,000 cases of 384,000 cans of tomatoes. The next year, they wanted to do 50,000 cases of tomatoes. They also wanted to can beans, red beets, and pumpkins. J. Weller, back in about 1904 or 5, called Ottawa County the tomato capital of the country. This area was so well known for tomatoes and tomato canning plants all over the United States. You had Heinz main plant over in Bowling Green, and you had a whole bunch of other tomato canning plants. It's surprising the number of plants that I did find. And you gotta stop and think, there were only 40 states back then, and everything west of Mississippi was the Wild West back then. So stuff would stop at the Mississippi River. Everything was between the Mississippi and here, so it wasn't a great distance for them. Okay, this is coming in from Jefferson Street, and we can tell when it was. It had to be about 1910, because the old school is still up there, which was torn down for the building that we have now. But that's the old school before what we have now. And if you notice, the number of pickles and stuff got larger. The horses are carrying a lot more things when they're coming in now. Okay, now these are a whole bunch of employees that we have. We know who one of them definitely is. The third one up there, and that would be Mrs. Jess that lived on Benton Street, Ron Jeff's mother. Well,
she was a nice lady.
And she was 14 years old when she was working at Weller. They had no child labor laws back then, so the teenage girls were there, and the teenage girls were the ones that were coring and going through and doing that. Gentleman here rode his bike around to deliver stuff for the packing plant uptown and everything else. Rode his bike to deliver the stuff. And okay, this is the one that fire bearer you see. This is just a postcard and a fire bearer view what they were, the one with the names on. And that was 1912. Okay, this is the last bottle that we can tell that came from Cincinnati. And it was Daisy, I believe, pickles, and came out of Cincinnati by J. Weller Company. And I haven't figured out how they got stuff in. The bottles are totally different. What they put corks in the top of them or what, because they can't screw anything on or anything else. So I have no idea how the stuff worked back then. 1916 was going to be a bad year for Weller. On April 29, 1960, Arthur D. Weller, the son of J. Weller, was killed east of Fremont when he was working to get cabbage acreage when he was hit by a train after he signed a contract. He wasn't paying attention, walked across the track and got hit by a train. On May 17, 1960, the plant burned down. They said that it would take pickles, but no tomatoes. They did have other plants. They had a plant in Greenville, Ohio for tomatoes and sauerkraut. Leslie, Michigan for pickles, and Clay, New York for pickles and sauerkraut. They rebuilt the plant in 1916 and was ready to run in 1917. They had 10 railroad cars of wood to build the plant, and it amazes me the amount of stuff that they brought in on the railroad consistently. Berto Concrete Company got contract for a new boiler room that was concrete, and the boiler room was still there when they tore the plant down. It's 42 by 65. This is a bottle that's a little different. It's pure gold, first one we've seen with pure gold label on, and it was made to set on a counter, which would basically replace the Crocs. Stores could buy pickles and sell them on the thing, just like Hasselbach have a gallon jug out there with large pickles in on the counter in the back of Hasselbach. They did the same thing in stores back then, and instead of the Crocs, they would use the pickles. Now, I have quite a few figures and everything. Weller's turned out to be the biggest factory we had in Oak Harbor. They probably had as many or more people involved as what David Betsy has or anything else. But the number of things that we had is just kind of unreal, the stuff that I found about it. This label is from 1922, when they were canning applesauce along with canning your ketchup and pickle. And there's a whole bunch of people that said they've never seen anything, or they didn't can applesauce. We definitely have proof that they canned many other things. They were looking to can peaches, but they didn't get any of that because they didn't have enough peaches to do it. Also in 1920, they were buying apples from the apple orchards around here, loading them in railroad cars and shipping out to be turned into cider, to be turned into the vinegar that they needed for processing tomatoes and ketchup. In 1923, they quit canning tomatoes. Now, when we talk about what they canned, originally they were canning whole tomatoes and cut up tomatoes along with ketchup and other stuff. They stopped doing the whole tomatoes and the cut up tomatoes and everything like that. They stopped using cans entirely because they had a labor shortage in 1923. The only thing they did was ketchup, puree, and chili sauce out of tomatoes in 1923. In 1924, they got new equipment to increase production 50%. 25% in tomatoes and 100% in cabbage. They did 4,500 tons of tomatoes, 2,400 tons of cabbage, 20,000 bushels of pickles, and they were giving farmers a bonus that they would use commercial fertilizer as opposed to natural fertilizer. In 1926, O.L. Teagarden, Oscar Leslie Teagarden, came to Oak Harbor and started in the sales and bookkeeping department. In January of 1928, Jacob Weller passed away, and from 1928 to 1932, B. Worth Weller ran the company. Okay, 1931, this would be coming in from Town Line Street again. You know, we've improved here. We also have trucks along with mules and horses. So we have trucks starting to show up, and we have quite a bit more, and these are tomatoes, quite a bit more than what you did with the old wagons. So things have improved greatly over what they had before. In 1932, they put two new boilers in. They said they had 300 horsepower each. In 1932, O.L. Teagarden took over Weller's on death of B. Worth Weller. He paid $29,375 for the plant, which today would be basically $605,888 what he paid for Weller's. However, he took in debt. Weller owed $2 million of debt at that time, so he took $2 million of debt on, which in today's money would be $4,125,000. It was kind of amazing the amount of debt that he managed to take on and the amount that he paid for Weller's. Where he got the money, I have no idea. Okay, in 1932 is when O.L. Teagarden bought Weller's. he paid $29,375, which in today's money, you're talking $605,000 paid for this plant, the plant in New York, the plant in Michigan, but he had $2 million worth of debt on all those plants, so he owed the bank $2 million on top of what he paid for buying the plant, and $2 million back then would be equal to $4 million today. And I have no clue where he got it. He couldn't have got that much money from just being a bookkeeper at Weller's.
Hey Gary, your script says 200,000 debt. Is that what you have up
Yeah, I
there?
got 200,000 debt.
Yeah, not 2 million.
200,000.
Which would be maybe
Yeah,
4 million.
equal 4 million.
Yes, there you go.
Okay, this is a picture of a packing pickles in the 1930s. This would be down in the pickle house that was basically shown to you earlier. They actually had a concrete floor there, and you notice the women are all dressed in white and have hairnets on, which at least they were doing something for sanitary. Okay, this is where all the jars went to go into a steamer and everything, so that you could actually steam and cook the pickles to the point of sealing the bottles. Just like you seal the bottles or put them in hot water to seal them nowadays. That basically was stacked for smoke and steam to go out, and the water lines and everything coming in from the boilers. And that's where pickle jars all went through, and then they were labeled later on. Between 1935 and 1938, we had a major change in production and everything with Weller. You had the Depression. However, the Depression did not hurt Weller's one bit. Weller's actually kept the people in town running. The farmers made good money from oil, and then all the people that worked there. In 1935, they led the state in production. They have payroll of $5,000 a week, which today's money would equal $108,000 a week for the Weller's plant. And this was the middle of the Depression. They added a 50 by 20 building on. They were going to add apple butter and pumpkin the next year. That didn't happen. They had over 300 people working, and it ended with a payroll for the year of $100,000, which today's money would be about $2 million for this little tiny old carver. They had 6 700-gallon kettles, which were run by William Sharp, which was the head cook that worked there for 35 years. The ketchup recipe was actually Mr. Sharp's recipe, and Weller's used that recipe for 35 years. In 1935, they bought a large Ford V8 semi-truck from Tri-Motors, Chet Young, and everybody knows who Chet Young was, I think. Chet Young did just about anything and everything in town. Chet Young was taken on as a driver to drive it all over the country, and he gave up his poultry, cream, and egg business to drive a truck for Weller. In 1936, they were canning 10,000 24-ounce bottles of ketchup a day. They can store 60,000 cases of product. They use 8 tons of salt a week, coal car load of coal a day, 160,000 pounds of sugar a year. In 1936, on a Sunday, OL did a picnic for everybody that worked up there for lunch, supper, and games that they had prizes for, was at Bark Inn. Now, there might be one or two of you remember where Bark Inn was. It burned down in 1955 and was out by David Bessie, what they called the Bark Inn curve. The big curve there is where Bark Inn was. And they went out there and they had a picnic for all the work. These are the trucks basically from 38, which some of them were bought in 35 and that. Now, these are only part of the trucks. They had some state trucks and some box trucks besides these. These were basically used to haul places in Cincinnati, Cleveland, Chicago. They hauled all over the country. They had a huge amount of shipping that they did out of here. Okay, these are started from the labels that we found, some of the early ones from 20s and 30s. The only one that seems to bother me a little bit is the one up here, and I found that, I didn't see it until a couple weeks ago. that says 8 pounds, 8 ounces of ketchup. All the rest are just, it doesn't say the amount of the other ones. And you have Weller's ketchup, and you have pure gold ketchup, and those were two of the big ones. Okay, 1938, OL handed out bonuses, 800 of them, for over $8,000. And again, this was in the middle of Depression, which would be equal to $158,000 today. He also was giving his salary up as mayor and gave the salary from being mayor to the library. Next one. Okay, this is 1942. If you notice, we've got trucks, and that is the scale house there. There was a scale house later on, and they came in and waved at tomatoes. If you notice, in 1942, there's still horses there. I went through and was trying to figure out, and John came up with one possibility. Okay, we were during the war. You had gasoline rationing. So rather than run a tractor or a truck in, the farmers still had their workhorses, so they hauled the tomatoes in with the horses rather than use the gas that they need for their tractors or whatever, because you had gasoline rationing and that. Now, the little building there with the thing is where you pulled up, and that's where the federal inspector would be. And the federal inspector inspected and graded the tomatoes or the pickles when they came in. Okay, in 1940, the plant still had 4 stacks, 1 for each boiler. Now, I don't remember 4 stacks at Weller's at all. I don't know, anybody in here remember 4 stacks on boilers? I don't remember a single stack. But in 1940, they still had 4 stacks and had 4 boilers. We have no picture. There's no pictures of the boilers any place that we have. We do have a gauge over there off of the number 2 boiler. Later on, the boilers went to from being coal-fired, which I can't imagine. Temperatures 90 degrees out in an enclosed boiler hall, shoveling a whole carload of coal into boilers. It just basically blows my mind how anybody could work shoveling that much coal, because there's no air movement in there. There wasn't anything to move air. There were very few windows, and everything else was enclosed cement block building with 4 boilers in it. Later on, they went to oil-fired, and then they went to gas-fired in the end. They had 2 gas-fired boilers at the end. This is really hard to see. This is from Sanborn map, and this shows everything you had there. This is the, up here, is all the pickle barrels, and that was still there when they sold and everything else. That's where the original pickle yard was, and everything else. Pumpkin canning was on the side of that building, and the pickles were processed in here for pickles. This was the cold frame and the greenhouse for raising their tomato plants to be planted. The lab down here and the scales right down here that you saw in that other picture. Okay, there's the boiler back in the back, and the coal would be right here. They got the coal. Your railroad track is right in here. They'd unload the coal there, and that was the boiler. These were the vats for cooking, and this is where they made the ketchup and everything. This is all storage and warehouse area down here. This is where they received the tomatoes and washed them and peeled them. This is the office, and the office actually moved over. It wasn't there. It moved on over there. But that's what the plant looked like in 45, and most of that was still there in 1980. Okay, this is a picture of the trucks they had after the war. Just after the war, is the Old Fort, the pickle station over in Old Fort and everything. We know who the people are. Fritz Diesel, we know it's after the war because Fritz Diesel was in the military and he's back there, so it had to be after the Second World War. Okay. In 1957, the town granted Weller permission to run a sewer line going down Center Street to South Railroad Street, down South Railroad Street, and then across underneath the railroad track, and basically you have the stuff right up in here. That's where the solar field is now, the town solar field, and they ended up having that. This is the railroad track here, this is Benton Street, this is South Railroad, and this is Beer Can Alley. But they put the tomatoes out there, they actually sprayed the water and waste in the air when they first did it. The ponds weren't put in. The town figured that it would save them $100,000 in sewage processing, and the cost to Wellers was about $20,000. Okay, John, why would it save the town money in sewer processing? Just what would the things you ran the sewage? Why would it cost the town?
Well, if you would take a bottle, a clear bottle, like sitting up there on the table, by the time they started putting their waste in it, that bottle was 3/4 full of tomato paste. And they were sending it out to the wastewater plant, and we just could not process that. It was too much. So the town made them put in that pipeline out there to the ponds.
And from what you said, they actually put a valve in so the town couldn't
Yes.
send the sewage back to.
They didn't believe us that we'd cut them off, so we put a valve in and we did cut them off. And all of a sudden, they put the ponds in.
Well, then, and then the other fact is you had a pump back through your system all the way to the other side of town.
Yeah, and like talking to Ron Miller,
You bet.
he's a good guy. He worked well with the town.
Okay, in 1972, the state was not going to give OL permission to use the waste field. And they said they were polluting LaCarpe Creek by spraying the water in the air and having it run off into LaCarpe Creek. I don't know what they did. There was never anything said about what they did or how they did it, but they got permission from the state and they modified the operation so they could still spray the stuff in the air and run the waste field. And there was no EPA. I have no idea who even controlled the stuff then. I know it wasn't our county health department because OL wouldn't have any problem with our county health department.
It
but
was
Molly,
the
you can't do it.
FDA that come in.
Huh?
FDA, Food and Drugs. I mean, they
It was
couldn't-
state though, but
Huh?
it was the state that wouldn't give them the license.
Okay.
And that's why I said there was no Ohio EPA, and I have no
Me
idea
too.
who controlled what back then. In 1983, they made them dig the ponds, and that's when they made them dig the ponds. They could no longer spray it. This is the big pond that they had. That would be the third pond. Okay, this is where the water came in from the wastewater treatment plant, and they aerated. The controls for it are the little tiny box up there that could control what they had in the pond and everything, and a box right up there. And the waste ran, after stuff settled out, the waste actually ran from this pond into this pond, and then it ended up going into the other pond, and from what we can tell, from that point, it would have gone into LaCarpe Creek. Basically, it was supposed to have settled out, and it was good enough to put in the creek at that point in time. The ponds were filled in 1999, because it couldn't be used anymore because the wire was cut. This is a picture of trucks going in the 1960s. I still haven't figured how they kept the baskets on the trucks. Ron Schimming told me they just stacked them and they're interlocked, and on the top layer they had fingers go down in holding the basket together on the top layer and everything, and they didn't have anything else on there. I never saw a basket of tomatoes on the ground along the highway or anything. I have no clue how they managed to keep the stuff on there without dumping them off. But they kept them on there. Nowadays, the highway patrol and the other people that go through public utilities, PUCO, would have a heyday being stuff wasn't tied down with straps and everything else, or enclosed in a box or something like that. But they managed to keep them on there without any trouble. Okay, this was all set up by the Wonderful World of newspaper. Every truck kept a bottle of ketchup in their truck just so you could take a picture of it for the paper. And of course, setting on there, he didn't knock any baskets off or smash any tomatoes or anything. And he was setting on top of the tomatoes, which you just couldn't do today.